The morning light filtered through the massive glass dome of the Galactic Academy, casting rainbow patterns across the floating study platforms where students from across the known universe gathered for their daily lessons. Amy rubbed her tired eyes and checked her simple wristwatch, a primitive device that made her classmates snicker every time she used it. Most beings here measured time through neural implants or quantum chronometers, but Amy preferred the steady tick of mechanical gears against her wrist. She had been at the academy for 3 months now, the first and only human ever accepted into the prestigious institution. The invitation had come as a shock to everyone on Earth. Humanity had only achieved faster-than-light travel 57 years ago, stumbling into it through what the galactic community politely called aggressive experimentation and privately referred to as barely controlled explosions. Most species took thousands of years to develop safe FTL technology. Humans had done it in less than a century through sheer stubbornness and a willingness to strap themselves to barely stable warp engines. Amy walked through the corridors lined with students whose very existence challenged her understanding of biology. There were the crystalline Velkari who communicated through harmonic vibrations, their bodies chiming softly as they moved. The gaseous nethers floated in their environmental suits, their forms shifting like living clouds. Massive Chronari lumbered past, their stone-like skin etched with natural patterns that served as both identification and academic credentials. The human section of the dormitory was a single room. Amy's room. She had no roommate, no study partner, no one who shared her peculiar biology or learning methods. While other students downloaded information directly into their enhanced brains or absorbed knowledge through specialized feeding processes, Amy read books. Actual physical books that she had brought from Earth, along with notebooks and pens that seemed almost primitive in comparison to the holographic displays and neural interfaces surrounding her. Her first few weeks had been brutal. Professors spoke at speeds that assumed instant data processing. Complex mathematical equations flowed past before Amy could even begin to understand their basic components. Three-dimensional models shifted and changed faster than her human eyes could track. She fell behind quickly, struggling to keep up with minds that could process information at rates her biology couldn't match. But Amy had something that kept her going: pure human curiosity and an almost stubborn refusal to give up. While her classmates absorbed information instantly, Amy questioned everything. She filled notebook after notebook with observations, connections, and ideas that seemed to form naturally in her mind. She noticed patterns that the other students missed, not because they weren't intelligent enough to see them, but because their rapid processing methods didn't allow for the slow, contemplative thinking that came naturally to humans. Professor. Veltar was Amy's biggest challenge. The Andromedan instructor stood nearly 7 feet tall, with 4 graceful arms that moved like dancing tentacles as she explained complex theories. Her species had mastered interstellar travel when humans were still discovering agriculture. She had personally contributed to 12 major scientific breakthroughs and held advanced degrees from institutions across 3 galactic sectors. Veltar made no attempt to hide her opinion of human capabilities. During lectures, she would pause when presenting particularly complex concepts and glance pointedly at Amy. Of course, some species may need additional time to process this information, she would say, her translator adding an unmistakable tone of condescension to her words. Amy endured these comments silently, taking notes and working twice as hard as everyone else, just to understand the basic concepts. She stayed up late in her room, surrounded by textbooks and handwritten calculations, slowly working through problems that her classmates solved instantly. Her human brain, with its electrical impulses traveling at what Veltar described as glacial speeds, struggled to keep pace with quantum-enhanced minds and biodigital processors. The other students weren't cruel, but they weren't particularly welcoming either. Amy represented something they couldn't understand: a primitive mind attempting to grasp concepts that their species had needed millennia of evolution and technological enhancement to comprehend. They watched her with the same curious detachment that humans might observe a particularly clever chimpanzee attempting to use advanced tools. Despite the challenges, Amy found herself fascinated by the diversity of thought processes around her. Each species approached problems differently. The Velkari thought in harmonics and resonances. The Kronari processed information through geological timescales, considering implications across thousands of years. The Nethers existed in a state of constant information exchange, their gaseous forms allowing for collective consciousness during problem-solving sessions. Amy began to notice something that her classmates missed. While each species had developed incredible capabilities within their areas of specialty, they had also developed blind spots. The Velkari's harmonic thinking made them excellent at wave-based physics, but struggled with particle interactions. The Kronari's long-term perspective gave them unparalleled insights into cosmic evolution, but made them impatient with short-term chemical processes. Each enhanced mind was both more and less than baseline consciousness. But Amy's human brain, primitive as it was, didn't have these specialized enhancements. She couldn't process information at light speed, couldn't download knowledge directly, couldn't interface with quantum computers through thought alone. What she could do was think flexibly, making connections between disparate concepts in ways that highly specialized minds often missed. She began to keep a separate notebook, not for class notes but for these observations about thinking itself. She documented how different species approached problems, where their methods excelled, and where they showed limitations. Slowly, a picture began to emerge of consciousness, not as a single phenomenon but as a spectrum of possibilities, each with unique strengths and weaknesses. Amy's reputation as the struggling human student was about to change, though she didn't know it yet. Professor Veltar had been watching her more closely than Amy realized. The instructor had noticed the human's different approach to learning, her persistent questioning, and her habit of filling notebooks with what appeared to be random observations. Tomorrow's advanced quantum consciousness theory class would provide the perfect opportunity to demonstrate the limitations of primitive biological minds to the rest of the students. Veltar planned to call on Amy to solve a problem that would clearly illustrate the gap between enhanced and baseline consciousness. It would be educational for everyone involved, showing the advanced students what they had evolved beyond and giving the human a clear understanding of her limitations. Neither Amy nor Veltar suspected that this planned humiliation would instead reveal something that would fundamentally change their understanding of consciousness itself. The lecture hall buzzed with the sounds of 200 different species settling into their seats for advanced quantum consciousness theory. Amy found her usual spot in the back corner, where she could observe without drawing too much attention to herself. Her simple notebook lay open beside a collection of pens that she had brought from Earth, tools so primitive that most of her classmates had initially mistaken them for archaeological artifacts. Professor Veltar entered the room with her characteristic flowing movement, her forearms carrying holographic projectors and quantum computation devices that would make Earth's most advanced computers look like pocket calculators. Her multifaceted eyes swept across the assembled students, lingering for just a moment on Amy before moving on. There was something different in her expression today, a predatory gleam that made Amy shift uncomfortably in her seat. The lesson began with a review of consciousness matter interaction principles that Amy had been struggling to understand for weeks. Veltar's explanations moved at the rapid pace that assumed instant information processing, her words accompanied by three-dimensional holographic models that shifted and evolved faster than Amy's human eyes could follow. Complex equations filled the air around the professor, mathematical relationships that described how consciousness could directly manipulate quantum fields. Amy scribbled notes frantically, trying to capture even the basic concepts. Around her, other students absorbed the information effortlessly through their various enhanced cognitive systems. She caught fragments of understanding here and there, but the overall picture remained frustratingly incomplete. This was advanced material that built on concepts her human brain was still struggling to grasp from earlier lessons. The fundamental principle, Veltar explained, gesturing with two arms while the other two manipulated holographic controls, is that consciousness generates quantum field effects through directed neural activity. Enhanced minds can achieve this through technological augmentation or evolutionary adaptation. Primitive consciousness, however, lacks the processing power to generate coherent quantum effects. The word primitive seemed to hang in the air longer than necessary. Several students turned to glance at Amy, their various sensory organs focusing on her with what she interpreted as pity or amusement. She kept her head down, continuing to take notes even though she understood less than half of what was being discussed. Veltar continued the lesson with increasingly complex examples of consciousness quantum interactions. She demonstrated how the Velkari could influence quantum probability through harmonic thought patterns, how the Chronari could alter material structure through focused geological consciousness, and how the Nethers could achieve quantum entanglement across vast distances through collective mental processes. Each advanced species, Veltar explained, has developed unique methods for consciousness quantum interface. These abilities require either technological enhancement of natural neural systems or evolutionary adaptation over millions of years. The precision and speed necessary for effective quantum consciousness interaction simply cannot be achieved by baseline biological minds. Amy looked up from her notes to see Veltar staring directly at her. The professor's expression held that same predatory gleam, as if she was preparing to spring a trap that she had been carefully setting throughout the entire lecture. "Perhaps," Veltar said, her voice carrying clearly across the silent lecture hall, "we should examine this principle more closely through practical demonstration. Amy, would you please join me at the front of the class?" Amy's stomach dropped. Every eye in the lecture hall turned toward her, representing visual organs, sensor arrays, and perception methods from across the galaxy. She had been hoping to remain invisible throughout the semester, quietly learning what she could without drawing attention to her species' obvious limitations. Slowly, she gathered her notebook and primitive writing implements, making her way down the steps toward the front of the room. The walk seemed to take forever. Amy was acutely aware of the whispered communications passing between students as she moved past them. The Velkari produced soft harmonic tones that their translator systems rendered as expressions of curiosity and anticipation. The gaseous Nethers swirled within their environmental suits in patterns that Amy had learned indicated amusement. Even the massive Chronari, usually indifferent to classroom drama, focused their stone-carved features on the approaching confrontation. When Amy reached the front of the room, Veltar towered over her, the professor's four arms moving in patterns that seemed almost ritualistic. Behind them, a massive holographic display filled the air with equations and three-dimensional models that represented some of the most advanced concepts in quantum consciousness theory. "Tell me, Amy," Veltar began, her translated voice carrying a tone of false kindness that made Amy's skin crawl. "What do you understand about consciousness quantum field interactions?" Amy looked at the complex holographic display floating above them, trying to make sense of the mathematical relationships and theoretical models. Most of it was beyond her current understanding, but she had been developing her own ideas about consciousness and quantum mechanics based on her observations of different thinking processes. "I understand that consciousness can affect quantum systems," Amy said carefully, "but I'm not sure that the effect works the way we think it does." A ripple of surprise moved through the audience. Veltar's four arms went still, her multifaceted eyes focusing intently on Amy. This wasn't the response she had been expecting. She had anticipated confusion, admission of inadequacy, perhaps even a request to be excused from the demonstration. "Oh?" Veltar said, her voice sharpening. Please, enlighten us with your insights into quantum consciousness theory. Amy stared at the holographic equations, feeling the weight of 200 alien gazes upon her. Everything she had learned during her months at the academy seemed to crystallize in her mind, forming connections that she had never consciously recognized before. Her observations about different thinking processes, the limitations and strengths of various enhanced minds, and her own struggles to understand concepts through pure human cognition suddenly seemed to form a coherent pattern. What if consciousness doesn't generate quantum effects? Amy said slowly, the ideas forming even as she spoke them. What if consciousness is a quantum effect? The lecture hall fell completely silent. Even the ambient sounds of environmental systems and breathing apparatus seemed to quiet. Veltar's predatory expression shifted to one of confusion and growing interest. Explain, Veltar commanded. Amy looked around the room at all the enhanced minds, the technological augmentations, the evolutionary adaptations that allowed different species to interact with quantum fields. Suddenly, she understood why her human brain approached problems so differently from her classmates. Every species here has developed ways to make their consciousness work with quantum systems, Amy continued, her confidence growing. But what if you're all thinking about it backwards? What if consciousness doesn't need to be enhanced or adapted to work with quantum mechanics because consciousness itself is already quantum? The implications of what Amy was suggesting began to ripple through the assembled students. If consciousness was inherently quantum rather than classical, it would mean that every theory about consciousness-matter interaction would need to be reconsidered. It would mean that technological enhancement and evolutionary adaptation weren't prerequisites for quantum consciousness effects, but rather might actually be limiting factors. Veltar stared at Amy with an expression that mixed disbelief with growing fascination. If consciousness is quantum rather than classical, then primitive minds should be able to achieve quantum effects without technological assistance. Exactly, Amy said, feeling pieces of a vast puzzle clicking into place in her mind. And maybe the reason humans seem so different is because we never developed the technological interfaces that other species use. We had to learn to use consciousness directly. The theory Amy had just proposed hung in the air like a challenge to everything the assembled beings believed about consciousness and quantum mechanics. Dr. Catherine, the Academy's most respected researcher in applied consciousness studies, rose slowly from his seat in the front row. His tall, ethereal form seemed to shimmer as he moved, a characteristic of his species that indicated deep thought. Young human, Dr. Catherine said, his voice carrying the weight of centuries of study. You suggest that consciousness is inherently quantum rather than classical. This would mean that the technological enhancements we use to achieve consciousness quantum interface are unnecessary. More than that, it would mean they might actually be interfering with natural quantum consciousness abilities. Amy nodded, feeling a strange sense of certainty about ideas she had never consciously formed before. That's exactly what I'm suggesting. Think about how different species approach quantum consciousness. The Velkari use harmonic resonance, the Kronari use geological timescale thinking, the Nethers use collective consciousness. But all of these approaches require some kind of technological or evolutionary enhancement to work. She gestured toward her classmates, most of whom were staring at her with expressions ranging from confusion to fascination. What if those enhancements aren't helping consciousness interact with quantum fields? What if they're creating specialized interfaces that limit consciousness to specific types of quantum interaction? Professor Veltar had been listening with growing intensity. Her original plan to humiliate the primitive human had transformed into something entirely unexpected. The equations and models floating in the air around them suddenly seemed inadequate to describe what Amy was proposing. You're suggesting, Veltar said slowly, that enhanced consciousness systems are actually limiting rather than expanding quantum awareness. I think so, Amy replied. When the Velakari think in harmonics, they excel at wave-based quantum phenomena, but struggle with particle interactions. When the Chronari think in geological time, they understand cosmic-scale quantum effects, but have trouble with short-term quantum fluctuations. Each enhancement creates strength in one area but weakness in others. A student from the back of the room raised a crystalline appendage. Amy recognized her as Lyra, one of the few classmates who had ever shown her any kindness. But Amy, if consciousness is naturally quantum, why do enhanced species perform quantum effects that primitive consciousness cannot? Amy considered this question carefully. It was the obvious challenge to her theory, and she needed to address it honestly. Maybe it's not that primitive consciousness can't perform quantum effects. Maybe it's that we don't know how to access our natural quantum abilities because we've never been taught to think about consciousness that way. Dr. Catherine moved closer to the front of the room, his shimmering form betraying his excitement. This theory could be tested. If human consciousness can naturally access quantum states, you should be able to perform calculations or demonstrations that exceed apparent human biological limitations. Amy felt a chill of fear run through her. The logical next step was obvious, and she wasn't sure she was ready for it. What kind of test? Professor Veltar's expression had shifted completely from predatory amusement to scientific hunger. Amy realized that the professor wasn't trying to humiliate her anymore. This had become something much more important and potentially more dangerous. Quantum computation, Veltar said. I will generate a complex mathematical problem that requires quantum processing to solve efficiently. Classical computation would take thousands of years. Our quantum computers can solve it in hours through technological enhancement. If your theory is correct, you should be able to solve it using consciousness alone. The lecture hall erupted, in sounds that Amy's translator rendered as expressions of disbelief, excitement, and concern. What Veltar was proposing was essentially impossible by any conventional understanding of human capabilities. Amy would be attempting to perform calculations that exceeded the most advanced classical computers using nothing but her biological brain. I don't know if I can do that, Amy said honestly. I mean, I've never tried anything like quantum computation with my mind. Of course you haven't, Dr. Catherine said gently. No one has ever taught baseline consciousness how to access its quantum capabilities because we assumed those capabilities didn't exist. But if your theory is correct, the ability should be there, waiting to be discovered. Amy looked around. The lecture hall at 200 alien faces staring at her expectantly. She thought about the months she had spent struggling to keep up with enhanced minds, filling notebook after notebook with observations and ideas that seemed to form naturally in her consciousness. She thought about the patterns she noticed that her classmates missed, the connection she made between seemingly unrelated concepts. What exactly would I need to do? She asked. Veltar manipulated the holographic controls with her 4 arms, and a new display appeared in the air above them. Prime factorization. I will generate a large number that is the product of 2 prime numbers. Finding those prime factors requires testing enormous numbers of possibilities. Classical computers must try each possibility sequentially, which takes an impossibly long time for large numbers. Quantum computers can test all possibilities simultaneously through quantum superposition. The number that appeared in the holographic display was staggering. It contained over 600 digits, a mathematical monster that seemed to mock the very concept of manual calculation. Amy stared at it, feeling overwhelmed by its complexity. How am I supposed to factor something like that? She asked. That's what we're hoping to discover, Dr. Catherine said. If consciousness is naturally quantum, then your mind should be able to access quantum computational states. Instead of testing each possibility sequentially like a classical computer, you should be able to perceive the mathematical relationships directly. Amy continued staring at the impossible number. She thought about quantum mechanics principles she had been struggling to understand in class. Quantum systems existed in superposition, experiencing all possible states simultaneously until observation collapsed them into specific outcomes. If consciousness was quantum, then maybe thinking could work the same way. "I don't know how to access quantum computational states," she said. "Neither did any of us until we developed technological interfaces," Veltar replied. "But those interfaces might have been unnecessary crutches. Try approaching the problem differently. Don't think of it as calculation. Think of it as observation," Amy nodded slowly, beginning to understand. Instead of trying to compute the factors through mathematical operations, she needed to observe the quantum relationships that already existed in mathematical space. The factors weren't hidden inside the number waiting to be calculated. They were aspects of the number's fundamental quantum nature, visible to consciousness that knew how to look. "I'll try," Amy said, though she had no idea what she was about to attempt. The lecture hall fell silent as Amy faced the most important test of her life, and possibly the most important test in the history of consciousness research. Amy stared at the massive number floating in the holographic display above her, its 617 digits seeming to pulse with mathematical complexity. Around her, the lecture hall had become so quiet that she could hear the subtle hum of environmental systems and the barely audible sounds of 200 different beings breathing, filtering, or processing whatever gases kept them alive. She closed her eyes and tried to remember everything she had learned about quantum mechanics. Superposition meant that quantum systems existed in all possible states simultaneously. Entanglement meant that quantum systems could be connected across vast distances. Uncertainty meant that observation changed the system being observed. If consciousness was quantum, then maybe these principles applied to thinking as well as to particles. "Don't try to calculate," Dr. Catherine's voice came softly from somewhere in front of her. "Let your consciousness explore the mathematical relationships that already exist." Amy opened her eyes and looked at the number again. Instead of seeing it as a puzzle to be solved, she tried to perceive it as a quantum system to be observed. She let her mind relax in a way she had never attempted before, allowing her consciousness to float around the mathematical relationships rather than trying to grasp them through logical analysis. At first, nothing happened. The number remained an incomprehensible string of digits that mocked her attempts at understanding. Amy could feel the weight of expectations from everyone watching her, and doubt began to creep into her mind. Maybe she was wrong about consciousness being quantum. Maybe humans really were just primitive minds struggling to comprehend concepts beyond their biological capabilities. But then something shifted in her perception. Instead of seeing the number as a linear sequence of digits, she began to sense it as a multidimensional structure existing in mathematical space. The individual digits seemed less important than the relationships between them, patterns that extended beyond normal arithmetic into something more fundamental. Amy let her consciousness drift deeper into this strange new way of perceiving. She stopped trying to think about the number and instead just observed it, allowing mathematical relationships to reveal themselves without forcing logical analysis. Gradually, she began to sense structures within the number that weren't visible to conventional calculation methods. "I can see something," she whispered, not wanting to break the delicate state of consciousness she had achieved. "The number isn't random. It has structure like architecture." Professor Veltar leaned forward, her forearms frozen in anticipation. "What kind of structure?" Amy struggled to put her perceptions into words. "It's hard to describe. The relationships between the digits form patterns that exist in multiple dimensions simultaneously. I can sense where the number breaks apart, where its fundamental structure reveals the components that created it." She was experiencing mathematics in a way she had never imagined possible. Instead of sequential calculation, she was perceiving mathematical relationships as existing objects in quantum space. The prime factors weren't hidden inside the composite, number waiting to be discovered through calculation. They were aspects of the number's fundamental quantum nature, visible to consciousness that could observe mathematical reality directly. "The factors are Amy began, then stopped, startled by her own certainty. She could see the two prime numbers as clearly as if they were physical objects, not through calculation, but through direct quantum observation of mathematical space. With growing confidence, she began to write the first factor on the holographic display. The number seemed to flow through her consciousness rather than being calculated by her mind. It was enormous, containing over 300 digits. But Amy wrote it without hesitation or doubt, and the second factor is, she continued, writing another massive prime number that contained the remaining 300-plus digits. The moment she finished writing, Dr. Catherine immediately ran the multiplication on his quantum computer. The display showed the calculation, processing for several seconds, then displayed the result, Amy's original 617-digit number. The silence that followed was profound and absolute. 200 of the most advanced minds in the galaxy stared at a human who had just accomplished something that should have been impossible by any understanding of biological consciousness. How? Professor Veltar whispered, her voice barely audible through the translation system. I didn't calculate it, Amy said, still somewhat dazed by what had just happened. I observed it. The mathematical relationships exist in quantum space, and consciousness can perceive them directly if it knows how to look. Dr. Catherine moved closer, his ethereal form shimmering with excitement. You accessed quantum mathematical space through consciousness alone, without technological interface, without enhancement, without any of the tools we thought were necessary for quantum consciousness effects. This changes everything we thought we knew about the nature of consciousness, another professor called, out from the audience. Amy recognized him as Dr. Thane, a specialist in consciousness evolution theory. It means we've been approaching consciousness enhancement completely wrong, Veltar said, her scientific mind racing through the implications. We've been trying to build better computers when we should have been learning to use the quantum computer that consciousness already is. Amy looked around the lecture hall at the hundreds of alien faces staring at her with expressions she had never seen before. No longer amusement, pity, or condescension. Something approaching awe and respect, mixed with a hunger for understanding, that she recognized from her own endless curiosity. If consciousness is naturally quantum, Lyra called out from the back of the room, then why can't other species do what Amy just did? Dr. Catherine answered before Amy could respond. Because we developed technological interfaces before we learned to use consciousness directly. Our enhancements may have actually limited our natural quantum abilities by channeling them into specific applications rather than allowing free exploration of quantum space. It's like learning to walk with crutches, Amy added, beginning to understand the full implications of what they had discovered. The crutches help you move, but they also prevent you from developing the natural muscles and balance that would let you run. Professor Veltar stared at Amy with a complex expression that mixed scientific fascination with something that might have been regret. Your species never developed the technological crutches because you achieved spaceflight so recently. You had to learn to use consciousness in its natural quantum state. Which means, Dr. Thane added excitedly, that humans might be able to teach other species how to access their own natural quantum consciousness abilities. Amy felt a strange mix of emotions as she realized how dramatically her situation had changed. A few hours ago, she had been the primitive human struggling to keep up with advanced minds. Now she was potentially the key to understanding something that could revolutionize consciousness research across the entire galaxy. But more than that, she realized that humanity's apparent disadvantage, their lack of advanced consciousness-enhancing technology, had actually forced them to develop something far more valuable: direct access to the quantum foundations of consciousness itself. News of Amy's demonstration spread through the Galactic Academy faster than light-speed communication. Within hours, students and professors from across the institution were crowding into available spaces to witness follow-up tests and discussions. The implications of natural quantum consciousness access were too significant to ignore, and everyone wanted to understand what it meant for their own species and specialized fields of study. Amy found herself at the center of attention in a way that felt completely surreal after months of being dismissed as primitive. Research teams formed spontaneously around her, each wanting to explore different aspects of what had been discovered. The Velkari wanted to understand how quantum consciousness might enhance their harmonic resonance abilities. The Chronari were curious about accessing quantum states across geological timescales. Even the gaseous Nethers wondered if individual consciousness could achieve what they had only managed through collective mental processes. Dr. Kethrin had taken charge of organizing the research, his centuries of experience in consciousness, studies making him the natural leader for investigating this groundbreaking discovery. He arranged for Amy to work with small groups of volunteers from different species, attempting to teach them the consciousness techniques she had used for quantum mathematical observation. The first attempts were frustrating for everyone involved. Amy struggled to explain processes that she barely understood herself, while her volunteers fought against millennia of evolutionary adaptation and technological dependence. The Velkari kept trying to convert quantum consciousness into harmonic patterns. The Chronari attempted to process quantum information through their geological timescale thinking methods. Every species tried to force quantum consciousness through their existing enhancement systems rather than accessing it directly. "You have to stop using your technological interfaces," Amy explained to a group of mixed volunteers during their third day of experiments. "I know it feels wrong, like trying to walk without your legs, but the enhancements are creating barriers between your consciousness and quantum space." A young Velkari named Harmony chimed in frustration, her crystalline body producing discordant tones. "But we have always thought through harmonic resonance. How can we simply stop being what we are?" Amy considered this question carefully. It was the fundamental challenge they all faced. Each species had spent thousands or millions of years developing their consciousness enhancement methods. Asking them to abandon those methods was like asking humans to stop using language or mathematics. "Maybe you don't have to stop being what you are," Amy said slowly. "Maybe you just need to remember what you were before the enhancements." Dr. Kethrin, who had been observing the session from the side of the room, moved closer with interest. "Explain that thought. Every species must have had baseline consciousness before they developed their enhancement systems," Amy continued, the idea forming as she spoke. "That baseline consciousness was probably naturally quantum, just like human consciousness appears to be. The enhancements didn't replace your natural quantum abilities, they just channeled them into specific applications. So we need to access our pre-enhancement consciousness states," Dr. Thane suggested. "But how do we reach something our species abandoned millions of years ago?" Amy thought about her own experience with quantum mathematical observation. She hadn't learned a new skill so much as discovered an ability that had always been present but unused. Maybe it's still there, underneath all the enhancements. Maybe we just need to find ways to quiet the enhanced systems and listen to what's underneath. Over the following weeks, Amy and her growing team of researchers developed techniques for what they began calling consciousness archaeology. Instead of trying to add new abilities to enhanced minds, they worked on temporarily reducing the activity of enhancement systems to allow access to underlying baseline consciousness. The breakthrough came when Harmony managed to quiet her harmonic resonance system long enough to experience direct quantum observation. For just a few moments, she perceived mathematical relationships the same way Amy did, seeing patterns in quantum space rather than converting them to harmonic frequencies. "It was like seeing color for the first time," Harmony reported, her crystalline body chiming with excitement. "I could perceive the mathematical structures directly instead of translating them into harmonic patterns. It was pure understanding." Word of successful quantum consciousness access by a Velkari reached the highest levels of galactic government within days. the Andromedan Empire, the Velkari Collective, the Chronari Stone Councils, and dozens of other major civilizations sent representatives to study the techniques being developed at the Academy. What had started as an attempt to humiliate a primitive human had become the most significant consciousness research development in galactic history. Professor Veltar, who had inadvertently triggered the entire discovery, found herself leading a research consortium that included the most advanced consciousness researchers from across known space. Her initial prejudice against human intelligence had transformed into deep respect and scientific collaboration. She worked closely with Amy to document and refine the techniques for accessing natural quantum consciousness. "I owe you an apology," Veltar said to Amy during a quiet moment between research sessions. "I intended to demonstrate your limitations, and instead discovered that my own species had been living with artificial limitations for millions of years." Amy smiled, remembering the fear and humiliation she had felt when first called to the front of the lecture hall. Maybe that's what humans are good for. We're too primitive to know what's supposed to be impossible. The research continued for months, with breakthrough following breakthrough as more species learned to access their natural quantum consciousness abilities. Each success revealed new applications and possibilities. Species began combining their enhanced capabilities with quantum consciousness access, creating hybrid approaches that exceeded anything previously achieved. The Velkari learned to use quantum consciousness for harmonic resonance, allowing them to achieve perfect quantum harmonic states. The Chronari combined geological thinking with quantum observation, gaining unprecedented insights into cosmic-scale quantum phenomena. The Nethers discovered that individual quantum consciousness could enhance their collective mental processes in ways they had never imagined. But perhaps the most significant discovery was that consciousness itself was far more fundamental and powerful than any species had realized. The technological enhancements and evolutionary adaptations that different species had developed were useful tools, but they were not prerequisites for advanced consciousness abilities. Every thinking being in the galaxy possessed natural quantum consciousness capabilities that had been waiting millennia to be rediscovered. Amy eventually returned to Earth as humanity's first ambassador to the Galactic Consciousness Research Consortium. She carried with her techniques for quantum consciousness development that would transform human understanding of their own mental capabilities. But more importantly, she carried the knowledge that intelligence and consciousness were not about processing speed or technological sophistication. True consciousness was about learning to think in harmony with the quantum foundations of reality itself. And in that regard, humanity's apparent primitiveness had actually kept them closer to the fundamental nature of consciousness than species with millions of years of technological advancement. The galaxy had discovered that sometimes the most profound wisdom comes not from enhancing what you are, but from remembering what you have always been. And sometimes the greatest teachers are those who are too naive to know what they cannot do.